Have you ever watched an entire room fall silent? Not for a celebrity, but for a girl no one expected standing with a folded letter in trembling hands. She didn't ask to be heard. She wasn't on the program. But in 3 minutes and 42 seconds, she reminded a nation what it means to be truly seen. If someone once taught you with patience, not prestige, drop their name in the comments. Hit subscribe if you believe in stories that don't trend, but stay. And share this with someone who once waited for your answer, not theirs. Karoline Levitt tilted her head, let out a small smile, and dropped the line like a seasoned prosecutor. Honestly, Jasmine, you sound more like TikTok than the bar exam. A ripple of laughter passed through the front rows. It wasn't loud, but just sharp enough to sting. The host, Raiden March, glanced sideways, trying not to react. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, not even a blink. But camera 3 didn't stay on the stage. It moved, quietly, deliberately, away from the lights and toward the farthest seat in the room, back row, right side. She wasn't on the guest list, not a speaker, not part of any political team, just a young black college student, maybe 19, maybe 20, sitting upright in a plain white blouse. Her hair was tied up in a high bun, and both hands rested gently on a canvas tote bag across her lap. She wasn't moving, wasn't shifting, wasn't checking her phone like others. She just stared straight at Jasmine, not with awe, not with judgment, just focus. Like someone who'd come to hear something they'd been waiting their whole life to hear, but hadn't yet decided whether it was happening. And camera 3 stayed on her longer than it should have. Nobody else noticed. Not yet. The attention was still up front where Karoline had just scored another rhetorical point, where Jasmine seemed to be letting it pass unbothered. But something about that back row, something about that stillness, was beginning to catch. It wasn't the kind of stillness you get when someone's bored. It was the kind of stillness you feel at the top of a roller coaster right before it drops. A pause with pressure behind it. The control room didn't cut away. No one said her name, and she didn't say a word. But the camera knew where to look, because in a room full of polished guests, stage lighting, and structured debate, this one quiet young woman somehow became the most magnetic figure in the room without moving an inch. She hadn't smiled, hadn't looked around, hadn't glanced toward the cameras, but she also hadn't looked away from Jasmine Crockett. Not once. And the longer you looked at her, the more one thought began to settle into the room unspoken, but growing. She's not here to watch. She's here for a reason. Nobody could say what that reason was. Not yet. But it was there. And for the first time in that debate beneath the lines beyond the posturing, something real had entered the room, and camera 3 was the only one watching it happen. Raiden. March leaned forward. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes flicked between the two women beside him. "Let's talk about critical thinking," he said. "How do you define it in your work?" Karoline Levitt answered first, her delivery. Sharp, rehearsed, intentional. It's the ability to sort emotion from logic, to build policy not from feelings but from facts, frameworks, and structure. Otherwise, we risk mistaking passion for knowledge. A few nods came from the front rows. She didn't smile, but her confidence was evident. She knew how to deliver a line that sounded final. Raiden turned to Jasmine Crockett. No rush, just the silent invitation to speak. Jasmine nodded once, then said in a voice steadier than steel, "Critical thinking is the courage to question even the beliefs you cherish most." The audience stilled. A quiet murmur passed through the center section, those seated not quite in support, but leaning forward now. Karoline responded with a slight tilt of the head. "Nice. Sounds like a Monday morning Instagram quote. There it was, the first jab in the duel. Delivered lightly, but aimed to undermine. A few chuckles scattered polite awkward. Someone in the third row smiled without knowing why. Jasmine didn't blink. Instead, she continued. But critical thinking also means asking why some classrooms still have students sharing textbooks, or why kids are told they're smart only if they speak a certain way. Now, the air shifted. Karoline leaned in, not aggressively but ready. So instead of a direct answer, we're pivoting to a story again. The tension wasn't loud, but it was thick. Jasmine nodded. I told a story because where I come from, stories are the only thing no one corrects for grammar. This time, the pause wasn't just on stage. It rippled, and camera 3 cut back to the girl in the last row. She was still upright, still staring forward. But now her fingers had moved. Slowly, with quiet care, she unclasped the zipper of her canvas tote bag. Inside, folded in thirds, was a piece of paper. Old, slightly creased. The top corner bent with a faint diagonal fold, as if it had once been tucked into the corner of a notebook or under a pillow. She didn't pull it out yet, just reached inside, just touched it. And though no one on stage saw it, though the rest of the room remained fixed on the debate, camera 3 didn't move, because something was happening not up front where the voices rose and fell, but in the stillest seat in the room. Back on stage, Raiden read a statistic aloud. A recent survey showed 62% of young people say they feel underestimated when discussing politics simply because their words don't sound polished. He turned to Jasmine. Have you felt that Jasmine didn't pause? I had a teacher who made me read aloud every word. When I got it wrong, he didn't correct me. He asked if I understood. If I said yes, he'd say, then you don't need to read it again. No laughter followed. Just silence. The kind that doesn't come from awkwardness, but from recognition. Karoline didn't interject. Her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. The girl in the back row slowly slid the paper out of her bag and laid it flat across her lap. Still folded, still silent, but now visible, if only to one camera. Back on stage, Raiden asked Ms. Levitt, "Do you believe emotion has a place in leadership?" Karoline replied quickly, "I believe emotional appeals are used to cover the absence of structured thought. That's not leadership. That's performance." Another pause. Then Jasmine said almost gently then, "You've never sat beside a student who couldn't afford the textbook and still came to class. The audience didn't clap, but their bodies moved. Shoulders leaned forward, feet shifted, eyes narrowed, like a room slowly turning its attention from a spotlight to a candle. And in the back row, the girl's hands folded over her paper, not to hide it, but to hold it steady. Her eyes had not left Jasmine. Not once. She still hadn't stood up. She hadn't said a word. But the air had already begun to tilt in her direction, not because of who she was, but because, somehow without anyone saying it, everyone knew she was about to become the reason none of this would be forgotten. "I told a story," Jasmine said, her voice steady, "because where I come from, stories are the only thing no one corrects for grammar." She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The line didn't land like a jab. It sank like a stone into a still pond. No applause followed, just a ripple in the room's atmosphere, a subtle shift in air pressure that no one could quite name. Camera 3 instinctively found its mark again. Back row, far right, same girl, same silence. But now both of her hands had closed slightly. Fingers curling inward, not out of nerves, but from recognition. Like someone gripping the edge of something personal. A memory, a moment, a line of dialogue that reached too close to home. She didn't cry. She didn't move. But her breathing changed. Because what Jasmine had just said wasn't theory. It wasn't politics. It was a truth she knew firsthand, spoken by someone else, but somehow echoing from her own life. No one else in the room noticed her shift. The lights were still on the stage. Karoline sat still, her expression unreadable. Jasmine didn't glance back. She wasn't performing for the camera. She was simply answering a question with the only kind of truth that lasts, the lived kind. But in that back row seat, a quiet collision had just happened. Not between people, but between experiences. There's a kind of moment that can't be rehearsed. One sentence lands, and someone somewhere hears themselves inside it. It doesn't require music. It doesn't require build-up. Just a single line at the right moment, spoken in the right way by someone who never knew you were listening. That's what had just occurred between Jasmine Crockett and the young woman no one had invited to speak. And the camera didn't look away. It held its shot on the girl's stillness, her hands resting gently over the folded paper in her lap, now held tighter than before. Her eyes never left the stage. But her silence had a new kind of weight to it, like someone who had just decided without even realizing that something had to be said, even if it had been written long before. Up front, the debate moved on. Raiden March adjusted his posture, prepared another question. Karoline leaned forward, poised to respond. On the surface, the pace resumed, but the undercurrent had changed. What began as another exchange of polished lines was now something else entirely. Jasmine's answer didn't just reach the audience. It activated something waiting quietly in the corner of the room. And for the second time in 15 minutes, the most important moment didn't come from a podium. It came from someone still waiting to speak. The debate was still moving. Karoline Levitt was mid-sentence pivoting to a comment about emotional rhetoric and the danger of mistaking community sentiment for academic credibility. Jasmine Crockett, still seated with calm shoulders and steady breath, was listening, but not reacting. The audience, however, was beginning to tilt not toward one speaker or the other, but towards something else. Something happening outside the stage lights. Camera 3 was already there. Back row, right side. The same girl. Still sitting straight. Still quiet. But now both hands had moved. The paper she'd kept tucked in her lap was no longer hidden. She had fully unfolded it. 3 folds carefully smoothed out across her knees. The top left corner still bore that diagonal crease, the kind that comes from being folded and refolded too many times. The ink was faint purple, the handwriting uneven. But every line had weight, like it had been written not for performance but for release. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't rehearsing. She was simply ready. The room didn't notice her yet. Most eyes were still front-facing, still watching Raiden, Jasmine, Karoline. But tension had settled in the kind that comes just before something real begins. The kind of silence you feel more than hear. And then she stood up. No music, no spotlight, no introduction. Just the sound of her chair gently nudging back and the slight rustle of denim as she stepped into the aisle. 1 step, then 2. No hesitation, no fanfare. Raiden March noticed first. His head turned slightly. Then Jasmine, then Karoline, whose eyes tracked her as if trying to place whether she was staff student or protester. But she wasn't any of those. She was simply there, with a letter in her hand. And she kept walking. Not fast, not slow, just forward. 5 measured steps from the back row to the center of the curved aisle where the studio lighting began to dim. She stopped just outside the main glow, her face half lit, her voice still unsaid. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. They just held their breath. Something was happening, and no one had any script for it. The girl didn't look at Karoline. She didn't look at the host. She looked straight at Jasmine Crockett. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'm not on the list of speakers. But if it's all right, I'd like to read a letter. A letter I once sent to Miss Jasmine Crockett." That was it. One sentence. No emotion added. No theatrics. But it struck the room with more force than any argument all evening. Raiden didn't interrupt. Jasmine didn't blink. Karoline leaned back slightly, arms folding out of reflex. Not defensiveness, just uncertainty. The girl unfolded the letter fully now. The creases lay flat. The top line had a faint scratch-out like someone had written the wrong name first. The words were handwritten, not typed, not flawless. But every syllable looked like it had been carried around long enough to survive being almost discarded. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't clear her throat. She simply began to read. And in that moment, the entire room shifted. No longer were they watching a debate. No longer were they listening for comebacks or applause lines. They were about to hear something not meant for them, and because of that, it meant more. For the first time that evening, no one was trying to win. No one cared who had the better degree, the sharper phrasing, or the firmer tone. They just listened. And the voice that had been waiting since the very beginning, the one no one invited, no one expected, no one noticed, finally spoke. She didn't stand for herself. She stood because someone once gave her a reason to believe she had something to say. And now she was about to say it, not to impress, not to argue, but to remember. The young woman stood in the center aisle, the creases in her letter now fully smoothed across her hands. No spotlight followed her. No music played. No one introduced her. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a staffer. She wasn't even on the program. But when she began to read, no one dared to speak. "Excuse me," she said, barely above a whisper. "I'm not on the list of speakers, but I wrote this letter a while ago, and I'd like to read it if that's okay." She didn't wait for permission. She wasn't asking for applause. Her voice wasn't trained or polished. It didn't rise or fall for effect. But it didn't need to, because the room, every inch of it, was listening. She unfolded the page slowly. The handwriting was in purple ink, faint in places, bold in others. At the top, just barely visible, was a name that had been scratched out. Not violently, just once firmly, like someone had corrected themselves after writing the wrong person's name. "Dear Miss Jasmine Crockett," she began. "I wrote this letter at the end of March while I was preparing my scholarship application. I didn't know how to start it, because no one in my family had ever written one before." The air in the studio grew still, like something sacred had begun. "I'm the daughter of a single mother. My mom finished 8th grade. She raised me working 2 jobs, one in housekeeping and one delivering mail. Growing up, I was told not to use big words, not because I didn't know them, but because people said I sounded like I was trying to be someone I wasn't. They told me, keep it simple. Don't show off. Don't talk white." But I didn't know what that meant. I only knew I liked the words I read in books and the ones my mom never got to use. The girl's voice didn't crack. It didn't falter. But it carried a weight that only comes from saying something that's been unsaid for too long. "Then one day I saw you. You were speaking at a town hall, and someone posted a clip online. You didn't change your voice. You didn't slow down or switch tones. You just spoke. And I thought, she sounds like my mom. And she's a lawyer." A few people in the audience exhaled softly. It was the kind of breath you let out when something hits close. I quoted you in my application essay. I wrote, "Education isn't about leaving where you're from. It's about learning how to return without shame." That line stayed with me. It still does. Raiden. March leaned back slightly, his hands resting together now. Not folded, not posed, just still. Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving. Her eyes fixed on the girl, her hand resting gently over her chest. The place where some people keep their fears, and others keep their strength. Karoline didn't look at the letter. She looked toward the edge of the stage, eyes unfocused, not in dismissal, but in distance, as if something had shifted, and she hadn't caught up to it yet. "You probably don't remember me," the girl continued, "but I sent you that essay. And a few weeks later I got the scholarship. It wasn't a big one, just enough to cover books. But when I opened the email confirming it, there was a short note from your office. It said, 'I don't need to know your score. I just want you to remember, no one is wrong for asking questions in the language their mother gave them.'" A middle-aged man in the third row bowed his head. Earlier, he had asked a question during the Q&A, something about funding gaps or educational benchmarks. Now he couldn't remember what it was. The girl held the letter with both hands now, as if it were more than paper, as if it were a bridge to something lost and now found again. "I kept that email," she said, "and I printed it. Because for the first time I felt like I wasn't wrong for how I speak, or who I come from. And if anyone in this room believes you don't represent real education, they should know you were the first person who made me believe I could learn without lowering my voice." That last line didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled over the room like a light blanket, soft but unforgettable. No one clapped. No one moved. For once, the silence wasn't waiting to be broken. It was the point. Jasmine didn't stand. She didn't wave. She didn't respond with words. She simply pressed her hand a little firmer to her heart and closed her eyes. Just for a second, long enough for those nearby to see her take a breath that wasn't for speaking, but for holding something quietly. The girl didn't bow, didn't smile. She folded the letter again carefully and walked back to her seat. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands still. Her eyes forward. She didn't look around, but everyone looked at her. Not because she'd taken the stage, but because for the first time someone had spoken who wasn't expected to. And it wasn't about courage. It wasn't about victory. It was about gratitude. The kind that doesn't get posted. The kind that isn't quoted. The kind that happens when someone tells the truth, and nobody argues. In a room built for debate, a single voice had reminded them all why people want to be educated in the first place. Not to win. Not to impress. But to one day return to the place they came from and say, "I haven't forgotten you." When the girl folded her letter and returned to her seat, she didn't look for a reaction. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't check to see if Jasmine was crying or if Karoline was watching. She just sat down like someone who had kept a promise, quietly, fully, and without regret. For a long moment, no one moved. Not a single hand clapped. Not a throat cleared. Even Raiden March didn't speak. And that said everything. Because the room wasn't waiting for someone to say something smart anymore. It was grieving for something that had gone unsaid for far too long. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to meet the girl. She didn't reach for a handshake or a hug. She simply pressed her left hand over her chest, just below her collarbone, the place where people keep what matters most, but never carry on their sleeves. Her face didn't change. No tears. No tremble. But everyone in the room saw her inhale and hold it, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew nothing needed saying. Across from her, Karoline Levitt stayed silent. She didn't offer a rebuttal. She didn't correct the record. She didn't smile. Her hands, once sharp with precision and confidence, now rested on her lap like they no longer had a script to follow. She didn't glance at Jasmine, nor at the girl who had just spoken. Instead, her eyes drifted off stage, past the lights, past the cameras, to somewhere far beyond the frame, the expression of someone who'd suddenly realized she was no longer the center of the conversation. Raiden March, who had moderated presidential interviews and televised policy forums for decades, did something he hadn't done in years. He brought his palms together, not to pray, but as a reflex. A gesture people make when they don't have words left. When something sacred has just passed through the room and all you can do is let your hands recognize it. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was earned. Because for once, this wasn't about whose side you were on. This wasn't about who argued better or scored the sharper quote. This was about the kind of learning that doesn't come with degrees, credentials, or perfect grammar. It was about remembering the first person who ever taught you something that made you feel whole, and realizing they might not have known how to spell it. All across the studio, eyes welled not from sentimentality, but from something deeper. Memory. Reflection. Some remembered the parent who worked 3 jobs, but made sure homework got done. Some remembered the librarian who let them sit by the radiator in winter. Some remembered a coach, a bus driver, a neighbor who said one sentence they never forgot. And now they remembered how long it had been since anyone said thank you. No one cared who won anymore, because the room had just been reminded what winning used to mean before we made it about applause lines and statistics. For some, it was the moment they stopped seeing Jasmine Crockett as the other speaker and started seeing her as someone who had carried generations of unsent letters without even knowing it. For others, it was the moment Karoline Levitt, once precise and cutting, sat quietly under the weight of not being spoken to, but around. And maybe for the first time that evening, she understood what it felt like to not be the one explaining. The audience didn't take sides. They didn't need to. Because in that moment, the real shift wasn't political. It was human. People didn't look to the stage for the next point. They looked at each other. They looked inward. And in that pause, longer than anyone spoken that night, the question changed. It was no longer, who made the stronger case? It became, who did you learn from? And have you ever told them? The girl never asked for applause. She didn't want to go viral. But the clip of her standing letter in hand, voice steady, found its way online. No title, no headline. Just a simple post from a small account. Letters we never sent. No hashtags. No dramatic music. Just a 3-minute, 42-second video from camera 3 quietly capturing what no one had planned. By morning, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Not by influencers, not by activists, but by teachers, parents, veterans, librarians, the kind of people who remember things that weren't graded, but stayed with them anyway. At a middle school in Atlanta, a teacher printed out the transcript of the letter. She handed it to her class with a prompt. Write a note to the first person who made you feel like you could learn. Some students wrote to a grandparent, some to a bus driver. One wrote to her mom, who worked nights and always asked, "Did you learn anything today?" even though she couldn't read herself. In Fresno, California, a community college canceled its usual orientation. Instead, they asked every new student to write a letter, not about grades or goals, but about the moment someone made them believe they weren't dumb. In Ohio, a public library created a bulletin board titled Letters We Never Sent. People left notes written on napkins, notebook paper, Post-its. To Miss Ngach, my kindergarten teacher. You never scolded me when I said the wrong number. I've never forgotten that. To the man who taught me how to ask for the price in English when I was too scared to speak. And somewhere in a quiet home office, a parent pulled out a torn letter from a drawer. A letter they'd written years ago, but never mailed. They smoothed it flat, picked up a pen, and finished it. Because something had changed. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It wasn't even a show. It had become a moment that asked a new kind of question. Who taught you not with answers, but by waiting for yours? No protests followed. No cancellations. No headlines debated who won or lost. Because the girl who stood up didn't speak to win. She stood up to say one simple thing: I haven't forgotten what you gave me, and I never will. The debate ended, but Karoline Levitt didn't walk off stage right away. She sat still long after the cameras had powered down, after Jasmine Crockett had quietly exited, after the girl in the back row had disappeared into the crowd of folding chairs and empty coffee cups. The stage was quiet now. The applause never came. No media scrum, no viral quote, just silence. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded page of her own. Not a speech, not a stat sheet, just a handwritten note. From earlier that morning, a few bullet points, talking points. One sentence circled 3 times: control the optics. She stared at it for a moment, then slowly crumpled it, not in anger, but in surrender. Because the truth was, she hadn't controlled anything that night. Not the optics, not the audience, and certainly not the moment that would be remembered. That belonged to someone else now. Later that night in her hotel room, 2 floors above the quieting city, Karoline sat cross-legged on the carpet. Not the leather desk chair, not the TV interview setup her team had prepared. Just the floor, barefoot, silent, watching the video again. Not the debate highlights, but the clip. The one shot from camera 3, the one of the girl unfolding her letter. The one where no one interrupted. The one where even she, a woman trained in defense, had nothing to say. She watched it a second time, and this time she didn't flinch when the girl said, "You were the first person who made me believe I could learn without lowering my voice." Karoline's hand rested gently over her own chest, just like Jasmine's had earlier. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her eyes softened. Just a little. She opened her laptop. Not to post. Not to spin. She opened her inbox. Typed a subject line. No one's ever too late to listen. She didn't know who she was writing it to. She didn't type a recipient's name. She just let her fingers move. Tonight I remembered something I forgot. My grandfather used to read the newspaper out loud to my mother every morning. She couldn't read until she was 9. He told her, "If you hear it enough, you'll believe it's yours." I became a speaker, but I forgot what it meant to listen. I don't know that student's name, but she reminded me why education matters, why tone is not the measure of truth, and why sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. She didn't hit send. She saved it to drafts. And then for the first time all week, she turned off her phone. The next morning, she walked into a public library in Baltimore. No press, no entourage. Just a wool coat, a coffee, and a name she'd quietly written on a post-it the night before. She placed it on the bulletin board, under the words, "Letters we never sent." It read to the first teacher who didn't correct me when I mispronounced Aristotle. "You asked me what I thought it meant instead. Thank you. I finally understand." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, Karoline Levitt didn't need to be recognized to know she'd finally said something worth remembering. And maybe in a world too often built on replies that quiet unclaimed and unrecorded, was the final word. Life lesson. Reflection. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, this story reminds us of something more enduring: the quiet power of being remembered. True education isn't just about facts, degrees, or how eloquently someone speaks. It's about the people who took the time not to correct you, but to wait for you, whether it was a teacher, a parent, or a stranger who believed in you when you doubted yourself. Those small moments shape who we become. As we grow older, we realize the most important lessons didn't always come from textbooks. They came from kindness, from someone asking, "Do you understand?" and meaning it. If you've ever had someone who taught you through patience, not prestige, now might be the right time to let them know. And if you were ever that person, for someone else, take heart. Your quiet gesture may have become someone's reason to keep going. Tell us in the comments who taught you something that stayed with you for life. And if you believe in sharing stories that matter, not just stories that trend, hit the subscribe button. There's more worth listening to than noise.